Okay, so this last presentation of the day for day one is going to be focused on JavaScript basics. Are either of you guys familiar with JavaScript or kind of know the coding language? So we use JavaScript to design our maneuvers, as well as using it for some basic commands in SimCreator and SimVista. So we no longer use SimVista for scenario development. However, Na is very familiar with that method back in SGL, and that would be more related to how we previously used SimVista for JavaScript. You can still find a lot of these JavaScript commands and tools in our SimVista manual. That would be very helpful for you to find out what things you might be looking for as well. But I'm just going to go through some basics of JavaScript and then a recommendation on a book that you can look into if you'd like. Or, you know, the internet has so much information these days. If you're looking for something specific, you can let us know. We can tell you what version of SpiderMonkey we're using, and you can use those specific JavaScript commands accordingly. So here's some basics. Each line ends with a semicolon. So if you need to write a command, you want to end that line with a semicolon. JavaScript requires semicolons to end prints, so you need to make sure that when you're adding a command line or anything like that, there's a semicolon at the end. Comments can look like the following. You can use a double slash to start a column at the start of the line. Or if you want to add more lines, you can use a slash and an asterisk, and then an asterisk and a slash to end that comment string. JavaScript is case sensitive. That means your variables that you create, as well as specific functions, are case sensitive. So make sure that you are paying attention to that when you are creating your JavaScript. Here are some reserved words. These are words that you cannot use as variables. They are words that have different meanings and functions that are embedded into JavaScript. We'll briefly talk about some of these. If you're familiar with any of coding languages, you might be familiar with this. This is very similar reserved words to what you'd see in C++ and even in MATLAB and some other coding languages as well. So to create a variable, you can set x, and we're defining x in this example as a variable by saying var and space x. So x is a variable, and it is assigned a value of 5. So that is essentially what that first line is saying. And then now the second line is we're printing that value x. And then as you can see below, that value is printed in the output as 5. The next example that we see down below is a variable y being assigned a string, hello world, and then that string is being printed, as you can see below. This is the same way as being able to use the print to print that string. Any questions on creating a variable? So functions are essentially a piece of executable code that is defined by a JavaScript program. You can create a function that has a equation or some other algorithm inside of it, and then you can use that function and call it multiple times from your JavaScript. So this allows you to create something and not have to redo the algorithm or type in the function information over and over again. So this right now is just doing a square. So it's saying function square, and the x is the input, and then the return is x times x. So it is squaring that input value. So we set a integer I and set it equal to 9. And then we set y equal to square of I, and then we printed y, and that gave us the value of 81. Any questions on functions?
If we pass an array, and like how does immutability work? Like if we pass an array and we move it inside the function, like if we
modify it. If you're importing an array, or
yeah, if we pass it as an argument, okay, and then we modify the array somehow inside the function. Is the array modified outside of the scope of the function, or
no? So the input that you're putting into the function, whatever that array is, won't get changed, but the output of whatever you're taking out of that function would. So if you, for instance, are sending in a string of velocity values or something like that that you're changing over a specific time, you can send that data in, and it'll calculate, the position the vehicle should be in, but it'll give you, that data structure, within the same time, or the same, like you'd be using one variable would be dynamic and the other one would be the dependent one, and then you'd do something like that. But you can use a function. I guess you can use a function to dynamically change a string if that's what you're asking. So you put in an input argument, and then you're just constantly looping it.
Yeah.
Right. So we use something like for loops that allow you to loop through multiple different iterations, changing those values if you wanted to do something along those lines.
But like if you change the array inside the function, is it change outside the function as well? Like if you pass an array.
No, it's only if you, for instance, no, you wouldn't be able to do that. Because essentially the function is only defined in here, and it's used basically as a way for you to execute a specific part of code. So you're not actually changing anything on the top level approach from there. Objects is a collection of named values, and then properties are usually the values inside of the object. So if you're looking at a example that we have right here, we have an object and a property inside of that object, and then below it is what we actually see in our SimCreator JavaScript. So scenario is our scenario component, and then it is of the property of that scenario component could be an ambient vehicle. So vehicle 2 is one of the ambient vehicles, or a vehicle that you've added, and we are currently getting the heading of that vehicle, the orientation of it, in the simulation. So that's what that line is explaining. So you can be able to get specific things using the functions that we've already developed that are defined in the SimVista manual. To create an object, you have to use a constructor. So we use this var o is a new object, or var now is a new date. These constructor functions allow you to create the object and then also add any properties to the object as well. To create an array is a collection of data values. There's multiple ways you can create an array. As you can see here, all of these are different ways that you can create one. So either I can add an array using saying var a is a new array, and then say a equals 0, 1, 2, and 3 like you see here, or I can just say a equals and put all of these things all in one block as an array as well, separating them by commas. So I can show that as well. And I think we have another example of that here. But you can either set them up individually or you can group them all together. in addition to that, these are operators. These operators are going to be similar to C++ and C. These operators allow you to put in conditions. So if you're looking for a specific condition, like if it's a Boolean, then, or if it's not true or false, you can use the exclamation. To make an undefined variable, you can use void, and then also to open and close arguments and functions and so on and so forth. So all of these operators are defined. They're very similar to C and C++. If you're looking for something like a specific condition, or if you're looking for how to use a integer and be able to use that operator inside of a string, you can look into this, and then you can also look online for those specific things. Equality operators, the double equal sign is our equality operator, so it'll look between two operands and see whether or not they're equal with each other. So you can compare two variables, or you can compare two strings and see if they are equal. Inequality is the same way, but it's checking to see whether or not they are not equal. If it's true, then it will, you can use the inequality, say if they're not equal, then execute this or return this. So logical operators, they are often used with if, while, and for statements. You can have a logical operator that uses an and or an or. Ands mean like if this specific condition and this specific condition occur, return this specific value. Or operations can be like if this specific condition happens or another one happens, then return another value. So they're very useful operators to add additional conditions to your JavaScript. So an if statement is what I was mentioning just a second ago, and that executes a statement conditionally. So if a specific expression has been met, then it will return that statement. So we use if else, and if statements quite a bit in coding, so that certain conditions can be triggered during your simulation. So right now, this example here is saying if x equals 2, print x equals 2, and then in the next one it says if x equals 2, print x equals 2, else print x does not equal 2. So the else is useful as well. We also have another command called an else if, and you can string multiple if statements together using else ifs if you have additional conditions. Another way that we can do that is using switch cases, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So an else if, like I mentioned just a second ago, allows you to add one or two pieces of additional code. You can continue to do this if you'd like and add multiple else ifs, but allows you to have different conditions to test to see if another condition is met, and then if all else fails, it would execute the last else block. So is there any questions on if statements or else ifs or else statements or anything like that? It's basically just a way to be able to set your if condition and piece together what you're actually looking for and what you want to return out of that as well. So if you have multiple if statements or repeated if statements, you can use a switch case. A switch case is a lot cleaner and easier and more efficient than repeated if statements. So instead of having a bunch of else ifs, you can use a switch case and saying setting the switch to the specific variable that you're looking for, and then each case would be whether or not that variable is set to whether or not the variable is set to the value in each case. So this can be very useful if you're going through a bunch of numeric values and you're just trying to execute different returns when it reaches that specific numeric value. A while loop is very useful if you're trying to repeat a specific action over and over again. This allows you to go through and essentially loop each one of the expressions until you reach a certain threshold, whereas in this one it's whether or not count is less than 10. When count goes through, this will iterate 9 times until it reaches 10, and then until it reaches 10, and then it would fail because it was not less than 10 after that. So it goes through and will loop over and over again and keep printing my count and the value. So it would go from 0 to 9. A do while loop means very similar to like an if statement. So it will do something, like some statement that you require, while another thing is being looped in. So this allows you to print a value while another thing is getting repeated. This example here is very similar to what we just showed previously, but rather than doing it at the bottom, you can do it at the top using a do while. A for loop. For loops are used more than while loops. Traditionally, a for loop allows you to set a variable and initialize the variable and set a condition inside of it and increment through that condition. So it has more control than a while loop, but it is also something that is finite, where a while loop can iterate differently. So essentially, you can use while loops and for loops the same way, but traditionally we would use a for loop to loop through a specific expression until it has reached whatever the condition is set in that for loop. So pre and post increment and decrement. So you can either count before or count after, and we use these counts basically in our for loops and while loops to show how many different loops or iterations it will go through before it reaches its stop. So if you may be running this, via sim time, and you only want to have it from 5 seconds to 20 seconds, then you would be incrementing between those two timestamps and calculating whatever you're looking for using that. So you can either increment before the variable or after the variable, and that will change whether or not the data is getting calculated before or after. So this is an example of a proximity sensor. We use this in Maneuver Designer now, but previously it was an example in our SimVista code. So this is something that you can find. You can find all of our example JS files in the system test scenario. Our STS files are located in the C databases directory on all of your computers. So if you would like to look at some of the practice JS files that we have in there, you can. This has 2 function blocks, a onInitialize block and an onEnter block. And then in this onInitialize block, it is setting a vehicle and moving it to a specific path on the road. So it is moving vehicle 8 to a location within the scenario and then telling it to continue driving down that path. And then in the onEnter, it'll tell it to join the roadway and then set a desired velocity and desired lane of that specific vehicle. So this allows you to control ambient vehicles in your scenario, but this example code here is just a proximity sensor that would get triggered when the ownership vehicle passes over it. Here are some references. I recommend using online resources as well, or any resources that U of M might have on JavaScript. This is just something that we recommend people get familiar with, as a lot of the scenario development and coding does require you to have some basics in JavaScript. Regardless, we do provide you with quite a few pre-done scenarios and maneuvers, but if you'd like to do anything custom, definitely good to get familiar with this. So, and that is it. Just in time.